Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Phil, and I'm a doctor who likes to play board games. And I like to play Rosenberg games. And in this video, I'm doing a little something different. I'm doing a quick unboxing and a side by side comparison of the game Kanal. Kanal, produced by originally by Spielworks as Oranienburger Kanal by Rosenberg, was re-released in a more retail fashion, I believe, through Mayfair Games, and so this is the English version that I received in the mail not too long ago, and super excited. Oranienburger Canal is one of my favorite games of all time. If you watched my video recently with the top 10 of all time, I believe Canal was number 4 for me. And it's a two-player Rosenberg game that kickstarted 3 years ago about, and now we have this version to talk about. So, starting with the wheels as a side by side comparison, there's not much of a difference between these two. You do have the numbers bigger on the Canal version as opposed to the older version where they are in the central part of the circle and smaller. They're on the outside portion in the new version. I think it's a little bit more legible with Canal, and otherwise they kind of function very similarly and just basically look different. So now we go into the comparison for the worker placement boards. In the newer version, and in the older version, I should say, that all the actions are pretty much the same. But the additions for the newer version include some player aid type of material and iconography to help remind you what free actions you can take on your turn, as well as the conversion resource conversion rates for the different pathways, roads, railroads, and canals that you can place onto your tableau. Those were all on one sheet of paper in the older version that you passed around. I like how it is here in a centralized place to help remind you that you can take certain actions and what some of those actions and conversions might cost. And then, secondly, a big change from the old to the new version is instead of using prestige tokens to keep track of victory points that you gain aside from the ones printed on the cards that you play, you now have a tracker where each player has their own score tracker that they're moving up this and keeping track of that in a centralized manner. And so that really does decrease on the amount of components that you're trying to keep track of and helps visualize easier where some people, or each of you might be in terms of where your scores are that you've accumulated through different effects of cards. And so I think that is a pretty neat addition. And here we have a comparison of the two tableaus that you have in each game. Once again, not much different here. The setup for the pre-printed pathways is the same between the two. Just notably, the configurations are different because of the cards. And in addition to that, there is a nice little slot on the side of the new version of the Tableau where you can put your resource wheel. And I think that is just a nice aesthetic to have in this game. So, a comparison to the cards, obviously, the new version has square cards versus the old rectangular traditional version in the older version. As far as the cards themselves, I think the biggest changes are or two things I should say, is the costs for each card are a little cleaner in the newer version. I think in the old version you had, all of the resources that you could potentially spend for a certain resource, and some of them wouldn't be there. I think that may or may not be necessary depending on your point of view. In either case, in the new cards, it just shows you which resources you need to spend and nothing else. And so I think that's a little cleaner. And of course, the rewards, the requirements that each, and I guess the effects that each card has in general. We'll talk about this more, but there's a lot of overhaul and changes to some certain cards to make the same card work a little differently. Some cards were totally removed, and so more on that later. And then here are the representative tiles that you can place onto your tableau. This represents all of the other types as well. The biggest difference, obviously, being that the older version had two different sizes in tiles. The shorter ones to put on the top and bottom, and the longer ones to put on the sides. Now that we have square cards, you only need one size, and so that greatly reduces the amount of resource or tiles that you would need to keep track of, which is nice. In addition to that, for those who might have some issues discerning the different types of tiles, whether it's due to color or what have you, you do have some iconography on one side of the tiles in the new version that have some texture or iconographic texture to it to help you discern between the different types of tiles, which is nice. So the last comparison here is a collection of different tokens that you're going to be using in the game. The action tokens are greatly reduced in size compared to the old one, and there is one less token that you use. In the solo mode, you would use that red token in the old version to block off a space. In both versions of the game, you still are only taking 4 actions. So instead of using that fifth action wheel or whatever it's called in the older version, and having that be kind of separate from the solo mode, it's kind of consolidated where you're just using that gray uh, gear token to either be taking the fifth action in a round in the multiplayer game or use that as the blocking token in the solo mode. And then you have the activation tokens in the new versions, those green, small little green tokens, which you can place once or even twice on a card to mark that you have activated it. In the old version, you'd have to just keep track of how many bridges you placed and or how many, if pathways and if all the pathways and all the sides of the cards are surrounded by some sort of path, then you would just kind of keep track of that mentally with how many times you've activated it. So I do like the fact that you do have these extra tokens to help you keep track of that and maybe not make a mistake that's unintentional. And then once again, we do not have the prestige tokens anymore. In the new version, we have the score track that is on the main board. So, a lot of people who were much smarter than me and had more time to dive into some of the comparisons when the new version of Canal was released with the rule books and everything, uh, trying to compare some cards side by side, there were some totals that were made with the amount of cards. So, in the original version, you had 360 cards, including all of the cards from the expansion decks, which are automatically included in Canal. In total, you had 225 of those 360 that were unchanged, but 36 of those cards were removed. A handful of those cards, many of those cards actually, not just a handful, a good quarter of them changed in terms of what rewards they gave you, as well as some of the requirements that would need to be made to achieve those rewards as well. And there is a great in-depth look into this on Board Game Geek, in addition to a lot of these changes to what these cards say. Uh, and as far as the removal of some of these cards, it looked like some of the mechanisms, as far as the icons and uh, the uh, requirements that you would need to achieve your rewards, were changed. For example, you had some of the icon or the abilities and the icons that were made in the first version of the game, like having a 90-degree angle with routes or being placed on the corner of the board. These were removed completely from the new version of the game. And looking at the comments of some of the people who have played both of these versions and compared the two, sure, there might be some additional complexity when it comes to deciphering the iconography from the first version of Oranienburger Canal, and so the removal of some of these newer or these older abilities or requirements on some of these cards definitely streamlines the game. I don't think any of these uh, particular icons were very difficult, with the caveat being that in my experience when I would play this game, uh, I sometimes would play it on Tabletop Simulator, and the mods of that, or the developers of that mod, really did a great job in typing out all the text probably from the glossary and pasting it onto the card so you could hover over the card and see exactly what it did. So I never really had to fiddle around with the iconography per se. And so, with the newer version, I suppose it'll be easier for me to play this in the tabletop analog state and not have to fumble around with some of what the iconography says and have to go digging into the glossary as much. And so it may happen. I think some people comment about there's still some editorial issues with some of the cards. Sometimes the iconography isn't as clear as it should be when comparing it to the text version that is present in the glossary. And some of the um, yeah some of the balance issues are probably still present as well in both versions, with some cards being better than others. I haven't run into that situation. I haven't played it as much as I would want to start to notice some of the differences there. Hopefully, one day I will have the chance to kind of seek out those. But in my personal experience with as far as balance is concerned, in a game such as Glass Road, where you basically have just the building tiles that are present in the base game and nothing has been revised or re-updated, since then. And so some of those tiles are just stronger than others, and you have to kind of plan around it and hopefully draw it and play it first in front of some of the other players as well. And so that's just kind of how you approach that game versus the more balanced approach, which I maybe as a comparison would be like Newsford. I'm sure there are some imbalances in Newsford as well. Some cards are better than others, but in general, I don't get the sense that there is imbalance in that game to the degree that a lot of people are noticing it or talking about it. As just from what I've seen on forums here on Board Game Geek. And so I do like the fact that that game feels pretty balanced when it comes to the cards and the card combos, and you just approach that game differently when you're strategizing in what you want to try to accomplish. And so I'm excited to play Canal and see if it feels any different compared to Oranienburger Canal. Will I miss some of these additional requirements, spatial requirements that I'm trying to accomplish on my tableau? Maybe, but there are so many cards and so many different combinations of cards that it probably doesn't make too much of a difference when it comes to the actual playing of some of these cards and how they work together and how interesting the puzzle is from game to game. So that just about wraps it up. So in sum, like my thoughts and recommendations, of course, if you are interested in this game and hadn't had the chance to back Oranienburger Canal, then the new version of Canal is probably the best way to go. If by chance you had the opportunity to look at both games and have either or, maybe if you want to be more of a completionist, you would get the original version, which has more cards, right? I believe they mathed it out to be like 6 cards were removed from each deck, and so you do have more cards to play with if you want to. You have more of those requirements and icons to understand as you play it, and so it's quote unquote a more complex version of Canal, which is in quote unquote more streamlined. But um, as far as the general play, I will play Canal and maybe touch on this in the future as far as which version of this game is better. But visually, I like what Canal brings to the table. I like the box art. I like the aesthetics of the game board and your personal tableau. I like the streamlined component version of having the score track and square cards, which allows for less fiddliness with the pathway tiles that you're playing on your tableau. And so I like the approach to how they did the components and presentation in the new version. The puzzle aspect, remains in question for me as far as how interesting is the puzzle. Does it retain that same interest that made this a top 10 game for me when it first came out? Component wise, I forgot to mention earlier, do keep in mind that there aren't enough bags provided in the new version of Canal. If you want to bag each deck individually and have enough left over for the separation of all of the other components. That I don't know how you typically do it. I try to separate as much as possible and utilize all the bags that are given in the game, and there quite wasn't quite enough of those for me to separate all the components equally. So I had to find like 4 or 5 bags from my own residence to be able to separate things out. So uh, be that as it may, other than that, everything looks great with the new version of the Canal. I probably would play this, especially if they supported the new version more with potential new expansions or content. Then obviously I would want to play that further. The chances of like a digital version, if it ever came to like BGA or something like that, I would assume that it would come from Canal and not the original Oranienburger Canal. But and so I would play the new version more. But I think it'd be fun. I don't know if there's anyone else out there. Comment if you have, if you have got both games, like and we're crazy like me, and have both versions of the game just to see and have them as a comparison. I really only think you need one version of these games, and you're more likely to be well suited for the future if you have the new version of Canal. So I would recommend you seek that out if you are interested in playing this for the first time. So yeah, that's an unboxing and kind of an analysis and comparison of the two versions of one of my favorite games. So let me know in the comments as well if you had the chance to play it for the first time, if you like this game. If you don't, just let me know. Thank you for watching and hope to catch you on the next one. Please schedule an appointment real soon. Take care.